The sharp blast of the train's whistle pierced through the stillness of the desert night like a scream of fury. It wasn't the usual sound of a train's horn, the kind that echoed in the distance as the locomotive slowly made its way through empty plains. This was a frantic cry, a warning, a sign that something was about to happen, and you could feel it even before you saw it. With nearly 30 years of experience driving trains, Harrison Blake had faced countless dangerous situations, rockslides, sudden sandstorms, even high-speed chases. But nothing in his entire career had prepared him for what was happening now. The Union Pacific 4872 roared down one of the most isolated stretches of track in the Nevada desert when suddenly its headlights illuminated something out of the ordinary. A herd of wild horses stood squarely in the path of the tracks. They weren't running, they weren't panicking, they weren't even moving to the side. They just stood there, eyes glowing fiercely under the train's lights, their gaze far from that of ordinary animals. It was as if they knew exactly what they were doing, and, more unsettling, they knew nothing could stop them. "What the hell is this?" Harrison muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the controls. He hit the horn again, the train's whistle blasting with force and determination. But the horses didn't budge. They didn't flinch. They didn't run, nothing like the wild Mustangs Harrison had encountered in the past. They weren't scared. They just stared. They stared at him. Their eyes were sharp, knowing, as if they could predict every move he made. A chill ran down Harrison's spine. This wasn't a routine situation. How many times had he been in emergency situations before? But this was different. The unease building in his gut was something he couldn't put into words. He scrambled to make contact with dispatch, his voice thick with tension. "Roy, do you copy? There's a herd of horses blocking the tracks. I've sounded the horn, but they're not moving." A long silence filled the radio, making Harrison's pulse race faster. Finally, Roy's voice crackled through, more serious than usual. "Harrison, don't get off the train. Don't do anything rash." Harrison frowned. What was with Roy's sudden panic? "What are you talking about?" "It's just a herd of horses." There was a long pause before Roy spoke again, his voice becoming grave. 20 years ago, another train disappeared on this stretch of track when it came across a herd of horses just like that. No one survived to tell the tale. "You don't understand. You need to stop now." Harrison's heart raced. Roy's words hit him like a slap across the face. Disappeared? No way. Those were just ghost stories, things the old-timers used to scare the rookies. It wasn't real. But now, staring at the horses standing motionless before him, Harrison couldn't ignore the growing fear inside him. What was waiting for him up ahead? The train seemed to slow, suspended in the silence. Not a sound. His eyes were locked on the herd, unable to look away. And then, in that eerie stillness, one of the lead horses lifted its foot and stepped forward, moving toward the train, slowly, deliberately. A shiver crawled up Harrison's spine. He knew something was wrong. Something was happening right in front of him that was beyond explanation. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. The train was still barreling toward them, and those horses were waiting for him. Then, a voice cut through the air. It didn't come from the horse, but from something else. "Leave." Harrison's breath caught in his throat. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, seemed to ripple through the empty desert air, like a warning he couldn't ignore. And in that moment, he knew. He would never forget this night. Never. The train's engines roared through the desert, pushing the massive machine forward with the force of a storm. Harrison felt the familiar hum under his feet as the wheels turned, grinding over the tracks. But as the train inched closer to the herd, the silence between the brakes and the machine's sound felt like an eternity. His grip on the throttle tightened, his palms slick with sweat. What in the hell was going on? In the distance, beneath the fading light of the desert dusk, the silhouette of the wild herd appeared, standing unwavering on the tracks. Harrison squinted through the glass of the cabin, trying to make sense of the vision before him. There was no mistaking them, they were wild mustangs. But this wasn't just any herd. These horses were different. They were vast in stature, towering figures against the open, barren landscape. Their muscles rippled beneath coats of deep, rich fur, some shades of black, others of brown and white, shining like polished marble in the dimming sunlight. Each one stood with an almost regal elegance, their presence commanding the space around them, as if they belonged to the very earth they stood on. Harrison could see them clearly now, every inch of their powerful frames outlined against the sinking sun. There was a smoothness to their movements as they shifted slightly, but none of them moved from their positions. Their heads held high, manes blowing in the wind, yet they were completely still. Eyes glowing, fixated on the train with an almost unnerving stillness. They weren't nervous. They weren't reacting as animals usually do when faced with danger. The horse's eyes, that was what unsettled him the most. They weren't like the wild animals he had seen before. These were not frantic, wide-eyed creatures filled with instinctual fear. No, these eyes were calm, deliberate. Dark, almost impenetrable. And as Harrison gazed back at them, the longer he looked, the more he felt like he was the one being studied. A low chill crept up Harrison's spine. He had seen all kinds of animals react to the sound of a train coming their way. Deer darting off in every direction, coyotes skittering out of sight, birds scattering into the sky. But this herd was different. They weren't frightened. They weren't running. They were waiting. He didn't know why, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. They were waiting for him. The train closed in, and Harrison's hand gripped the throttle with even more force. Why weren't they moving? This wasn't normal. His pulse raced as his thoughts flickered back to Roy's warning. Could it be true? Was something unnatural happening here? The train's horn blared again, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet of the desert. He had to clear the tracks, they had to move. But still, the horses stood firm. Still as statues. Harrison's throat tightened, the air thickening with the feeling of impending doom. He'd been on this route countless times, but nothing, not a single moment in his career, had ever felt like this. His instincts screamed at him to act, to make the train stop before it was too late, but a strange weight held him in place. He grabbed the radio, his fingers fumbling as he tried to make contact again. "Roy, damn it, Roy, are you there?" he said, his voice strained with a mix of fear and frustration. His heart was pounding in his chest now, a loud, frantic beat that drowned out the usual calm of the desert night. The static crackled for a few long seconds before Roy's voice came through, low and urgent. "Harrison, whatever you do, do not leave the train. Stay where you are. Don't get out of that cabin." Harrison's brow furrowed. He had never heard Roy like this. "Roy, what the hell is going on? It's just a damn herd of horses. I've been through worse, but they're not moving." Roy was silent for a long moment. And then, finally, his voice dropped, becoming barely more than a whisper. 20 years ago, another train came through this stretch of track. They encountered a herd just like the one you're looking at now. They never came back. Harrison froze, the air in his lungs frozen as well. He had heard the stories, the old-timers' tales of missing crews and trains vanishing without a trace. They were just that, stories. Nothing more. But as Harrison looked out the window again, as his eyes locked with those of the wild horses, the stories no longer felt like nonsense. He could feel the air growing heavier, thick with something else, something that wasn't just about wild animals on a track. There was more to this. Much more. The herd didn't stir. Even as the train grew closer, closer still, they simply stood, their heads high, eyes never leaving Harrison. The tension in the air felt like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could feel the unease crawling through his veins, each second dragging like an eternity. Without warning, one of the horses, the largest one, standing at the center of the herd, took a single step forward. Harrison's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. This wasn't right. The movement was deliberate, not out of fear, but out of something more purposeful. Something with intent. The horse stepped forward again, its hooves striking the gravel softly but firmly. The air seemed to vibrate with its approach. And then the others followed, their movement perfectly synchronized, as if they were one entity, a living, breathing force of nature. Harrison's hand hovered over the controls, but his fingers were paralyzed. He couldn't bring himself to pull the brakes any harder. His heart was thumping wildly in his chest, pounding in his ears, as he faced this eerie procession. The train was now mere yards from the horses, the roar of the engines growing louder, but still, they didn't move. They just advanced. The space between them and the train closed, and Harrison knew in that moment, these weren't ordinary horses. These horses weren't here by accident. The reality of the situation hit him hard. His chest tightened, and his skin went cold. The train was inching closer, and he was at the center of a strange, inexplicable encounter. The powerlessness he felt was overwhelming. There was no reversing this. No turning back. And then, just as the train closed in on the herd, it happened. A voice, soft and indistinct, like the whisper of a breeze, "Leave." The words came not from any of the horses, but from the air itself. Harrison froze. His breath caught in his throat. That voice. It didn't belong to a horse. It didn't belong to anything alive. It was like something ancient, something old, was speaking to him, telling him to leave. He knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just a warning. It was a command. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch as the horses stood in front of him, unwavering, as if they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. The train's brakes screeched loudly, the sound like a warning bell echoing through the silent desert. Harrison Blake's grip on the throttle tightened as his eyes never left the herd of wild horses, still blocking the track ahead. The train was now only a few yards from them, the powerful engine hissing and groaning under the pressure, but the horses didn't move. Not even an inch. Their gazes were fixed, unwavering, unblinking. Harrison felt his chest tighten. He could feel the pounding of his heart in his ears, louder than the hum of the train. Sweat beaded on his forehead, the air inside the cabin growing thick, stifling. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and despite all his years of experience, despite his calm and collected demeanor when faced with danger, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. He reached for the radio again, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked up the receiver. His mind raced, searching for some logical explanation for this bizarre situation. But deep down, a part of him already knew, this was no ordinary encounter. There was something far more unsettling happening here. "Roy," he said, his voice thick with unease. "Roy, you there?" The radio crackled with static before Roy's voice came through, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual calm, professional tone that Harrison was used to. There was an unmistakable edge to Roy's voice, a tone that sent a chill down Harrison's spine. "Yeah, I'm here, Harrison. What's going on? You okay?" Roy's voice was tense, tight. "I don't know, man. There's a herd of wild horses blocking the tracks. I've hit the horn, but they're not moving. They're just standing there, staring at me. And it's not right. They're not acting like any wild animals I've seen." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Harrison wondered if the radio had gone dead. But then Roy's voice came through again, softer this time, edged with something that sounded like fear. "Harrison, listen to me very carefully," Roy said. "Do not get off the train. Don't leave that cabin. I mean it. You stay put. Don't move a muscle." Harrison's eyes widened. He'd known Roy for years, and this was the first time he had heard his friend sound so shaken. It was unnerving. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but Roy interrupted him before he could. "Something's not right about this," Roy continued, his voice low, almost whispering. "Whatever you do, you keep the train moving. Don't stop. Don't try to get out and clear the tracks. Do you hear me? You don't know what's out there." Harrison's mind raced. What does he mean by "you don't know what's out there"? Was this just a herd of wild horses, or was something far worse waiting for him? "Roy, what the hell are you talking about?" Harrison's voice had grown more urgent. "It's just a damn herd. I've seen wild animals on the tracks 1,000 times before. They run off. What's the big deal?" A long silence stretched between them, and Harrison felt the weight of Roy's words hanging heavily in the air. Then, with a deep sigh, Roy's voice came through again, slower, more deliberate. "Harrison, 20 years ago, another train came through this stretch of track. They hit a herd of wild horses. Same thing, horses blocking the tracks, not moving, standing still. The crew stopped to get out and clear the way, just like you're thinking about doing right now." Roy paused, and Harrison could hear the sound of Roy shifting in his chair on the other end of the line. They were never seen again. No sign of the crew. No sign of a struggle. Just an empty train, still running. We found it the next day. And there was nothing left. Harrison's stomach dropped. He could feel the air leaving his lungs as his mind tried to process what Roy had just told him. A missing train? A crew that disappeared without a trace? It sounded like the kind of folklore that every railroad worker knew. But hearing it from Roy, with that tone in his voice, made it all feel too real. And too dangerous. "You're telling me a whole crew vanished?" Harrison whispered into the radio, unable to comprehend the enormity of the situation. "Yeah," Roy replied. "They say it was the horses. But no one really knows for sure. Some say they were cursed, others say it was something darker. But the crew, they didn't come back. And we don't know what happened to them. That stretch of track, it's not just dangerous. It's cursed, Harrison. I'm telling you, you don't want to stop the train." Harrison stared out the window at the still forms of the horses, the eerie quiet surrounding them. The train was almost on top of them now. He felt the weight of Roy's words pressing down on him. Cursed? A crew lost to the desert? It all sounded like a story to scare the rookies, like the kind of campfire tale old-timers would laugh about. But there was something in Roy's voice that made it impossible to dismiss. "Roy, what do you mean something darker?" Harrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly happened out there?" There was another long pause before Roy spoke again, this time with a tone that sent a shiver up Harrison's spine. "I don't know, Harrison," Roy admitted. "I don't know what's out there. But the last time something like this happened, there was no sign of the crew. No bodies. No nothing. Just a ghost train that kept running, without them." The words hit Harrison like a freight train of their own. The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy, as if the very air around them had thickened. He stared at the horses again. They weren't just blocking the track. They weren't just animals waiting to scatter. They were waiting for something. Or someone. And it felt as if they were waiting for him. Harrison's breath quickened. His hand trembled on the radio, but he didn't know what to do with himself. The air inside the cabin seemed thicker now. His mind was racing, and the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears drowned out the rumble of the train's engines. "Roy, what do you think I should do?" Harrison asked, his voice barely audible. "You keep moving," Roy said, his tone firm. "Do not stop. You'll know when it's time to stop. But right now, I'm telling you, do not stop. You hear me, Harrison? You just keep going." Harrison's chest tightened as he processed Roy's words. His fingers hovered over the throttle, unsure of what to do next. He knew Roy was right. He had no choice. But the deeper part of him, the part that had kept him calm through years of challenges on the tracks, was fighting the instinct to act. Something primal inside him screamed for him to stop, to investigate, to do something. But Roy's voice, the warning, the eerie sense of foreboding, it kept him in place. The train was now inches from the herd, the sound of the engine roaring louder, the air vibrating with tension. Harrison could feel his hands begin to sweat. He tried to steady himself, but the closer he got, the more it felt as though he was about to drive headfirst into something he could not understand, something that would change everything he knew. "Harrison?" Roy's voice came through the radio again, but this time it was softer, quieter. "Do you see it? Do you see what's happening?" Harrison swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wasn't sure if he could even answer Roy. He could only stare at the horses, the stillness of the herd, their eyes like dark pools reflecting the headlights of the train. The horses moved slightly. The entire herd took a synchronized step forward, not in fear, but in calm, measured precision. "Yeah, I see it," Harrison whispered. "And I don't know what's going to happen next." The tension in the cabin grew unbearable. The hum of the train's engines, the faint screech of the wheels, the rhythmic thumping of the tracks beneath, all of it seemed to blur into the background as Harrison's attention remained fixed on the herd ahead. The horses were still standing there, their dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel his pulse racing, his breath shallow, and yet he couldn't look away. They weren't like any wild horses he had ever encountered. They didn't move. Not a single horse twitched an ear, blinked, or flinched. It was as though the herd had been frozen in time, standing motionless at the threshold of something unknowable, something ancient. But then, in the deepest silence, something changed. Harrison's hand instinctively tightened around the throttle, but his mind was elsewhere, struggling to comprehend what was happening. His heart skipped a beat. The leader of the herd, the massive stallion that had been standing at the forefront of the group, took one deliberate step forward. The others remained still, as if waiting for their leader's signal. The stallion's presence was commanding, its large form like a shadow in the growing dusk. Harrison could feel the weight of the animal's stare, its eyes boring into him. And then, to his horror, the stallion did something that made his blood run cold. It opened its mouth. It wasn't a snort. It wasn't a whinny. It wasn't a sound any horse would make. The stallion spoke. "Leave." The single word sliced through the air like a knife, its sound chilling and alien. Harrison's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in disbelief. It wasn't possible. Horses didn't speak. They couldn't. Yet here it was, a voice, clear and direct, emanating from the mouth of the creature. The word echoed in his ears, lingering in the cabin, wrapping around his mind like an unshakable fog. "Leave." He shook his head, as if trying to shake off the reality of the situation. It had to be his imagination. He was just exhausted, stressed. This wasn't happening. Horses didn't talk. It was impossible. But the word lingered. It echoed in his mind, and the unease he had been feeling only grew stronger. That voice had been real. That command had been real. And it wasn't just the words. It was the way the stallion had spoken them, as if it understood exactly what would happen next. The stallion's eyes remained locked onto him, its expression unreadable but full of something he couldn't quite grasp. In the back of his mind, Harrison heard Roy's voice again, warning him not to stop, not to get off the train. The fear in Roy's tone now seemed justified. But why? Why had the stallion spoken? What was this? Some kind of trick? A bad dream? No. This wasn't a dream. This was real. And something far more sinister was unfolding. Harrison's gaze darted around the cabin, looking for something to anchor him, something to explain what was happening, but there was nothing. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The herd wasn't just standing in the way of the train. They were waiting. And that stallion, that creature, was at the center of it all. Then, just as Harrison was about to speak, to ask himself what to do, he heard something else. A voice. It wasn't from the horses, it wasn't from the radio, it was a voice he recognized, a voice from his past. Harrison? Harrison froze. His pulse stopped for a moment. The voice, it couldn't be. It couldn't be him. Miles? Harrison's voice trembled as he muttered the name under his breath. Miles Carter? The voice on the other end of the line was faint, distant, like a whisper from a faraway place. But it was unmistakably Miles. His old friend. A man who had vanished without a trace more than 2 decades ago, right here on these tracks. Miles, is that you? Harrison whispered into the empty cabin, the words barely escaping his lips. He couldn't believe it. His old partner, his friend, Miles Carter, had disappeared one night while working a similar route. There had been no sign of him, no evidence of what had happened. Just a trail that led to nowhere. And now, his voice, faint but clear, was coming through the static on the radio. You finally made it, Harrison, Miles' voice said, a hint of something that sounded almost like relief. I knew you'd come. Harrison's blood ran cold. Miles? It couldn't be. Miles had been dead. Lost to the desert, to the same curse that seemed to haunt these tracks. His mind spun as the words he had once heard, the tales of ghost trains, missing workers, and strange happenings, flooded back to him. But this wasn't a story. This was real. Miles' voice was real. Miles, where are you? What's going on? How are you even? But Miles' voice interrupted him, calm and measured, as though nothing were out of the ordinary. You're on the wrong side of the tracks, Harrison, Miles said. His words were deliberate, each one weighing heavier than the last. You should have stopped when you had the chance. But you didn't. You kept going. And now, it's too late. Harrison felt his throat tighten as if invisible hands were choking the words from him. The stallion's gaze seemed to intensify, as if it too was waiting for Harrison to speak, to acknowledge what was happening. Miles, you're dead, Harrison choked out, his voice breaking. You can't be here. You can't. Oh, but I am, Miles replied, his voice impossibly calm. And so are you, Harrison. You've crossed over. You've made the choice, and now you have to face it. The radio crackled as Miles' voice faded out, replaced by a sudden rush of static. The eerie quiet in the cabin was deafening. Harrison's head was spinning, his thoughts tumbling over each other, struggling to understand the situation. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then the air seemed to shift. The temperature in the cabin dropped, the coldness settling deep into his bones. The horses in front of the train were still, but now their eyes seemed to glow brighter, more intense. The stallion that had spoken took another slow, deliberate step forward. Leave. The words reverberated through the air once more, this time filled with a strange, haunting finality. Harrison couldn't move. He was rooted to his seat, his eyes locked onto the leader of the herd. A part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, but he couldn't. The weight of the moment was too much. It felt as if the very desert, the earth beneath him, was pressing in on him, trapping him in this impossible situation. And then, in that breathless pause, Harrison realized something. He had heard the stories. He had heard the warnings. But in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just about the train. This wasn't just about the horses. This was something older. Something more ancient. Something tied to the very land he had crossed for decades. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing with terrifying certainty: the desert had claimed him. And as the last vestiges of Miles' voice echoed in his mind, the reality of his fate began to settle in. There would be no turning back. The train was no longer his to command. The cold air in the cabin felt thicker now, wrapping around Harrison like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as the words from the radio, Miles' voice, still echoed in his mind. The voice of his old friend, the man who had disappeared 20 years ago on the same stretch of tracks, haunted him. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, here he was, facing an unimaginable reality that no one could have prepared him for. Leave. The word repeated itself in his mind, bouncing against the walls of the cabin like an endless drumbeat. He tried to focus, to steady his thoughts, but it felt as though the desert had swallowed him whole. The train wasn't just moving through space now, it was moving through time, through a veil of something ancient, something out of his control. As the seconds ticked by, Harrison's hands gripped the controls of the train with an ironclad resolve, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The cold sweat on his brow, the pounding in his ears, they were all signs that something terrible was about to unfold. And then, the memories began to flood back, memories of Miles Carter, his friend and colleague who had vanished without a trace, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions in his wake. It had been 20 years ago, but the details were still clear in Harrison's mind. Miles had been part of the team that was supposed to run the route through the desert, just like Harrison was doing now. The two men had worked together for years, their friendship forged through the heat of the tracks and the long hours spent behind the controls of the train. They had talked about everything, from family to the future, to the strange and eerie things they had both experienced during their years on the job. But the one thing they had never discussed was what happened to Miles that night. It was a typical evening shift, or so Harrison had thought. They were on the same route, running the Union Pacific 4872, just like always. But that night, something was different. A strange stillness had settled over the desert as they approached the stretch of track where the old legend said a train could disappear. And that was the last time Harrison saw Miles. His friend had been at the controls of a different locomotive when the train disappeared. The next day, the train was found still running, the lights flickering, the engine hot, but the crew gone. No sign of a struggle. No sign of the men who had been there just hours earlier. Harrison had always dismissed the stories as superstition. After all, no one had ever truly explained the disappearance. And yet, the strange occurrences, the missing trains, the eerie warnings from Roy, they all started to make sense now. The herd. The whisper. Miles. They were all connected. And somehow, he had been pulled into this strange, supernatural web. Harrison's thoughts swirled like the winds outside, and the darkness pressed in around him. He stared out the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, hoping to see anything, something, that would explain the inexplicable. But the desert was as still as ever, save for the faint glow of the horse's eyes, which still shone with an otherworldly intensity. He was starting to understand. They weren't just wild horses. They were part of something much larger. Something older. Something that had been waiting for him. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows and shaking the train. The atmosphere was oppressive, thick with the sense of impending doom. He had to do something. But what? What could he possibly do when the very laws of nature seemed to be breaking down around him? Suddenly, a sound pierced the stillness of the cabin. A sharp, metallic creak. It came from somewhere outside the train. Harrison's heart jumped into his throat. He turned his head toward the sound, but there was nothing to see. The darkness swallowed everything outside, leaving only the vague shapes of the horses, standing like sentinels in the night. Another creak. This time, louder. And then, a low rumble. Harrison's eyes went wide. It wasn't the sound of the train's engines. It wasn't the sound of the tracks. No. It was a sound that came from somewhere else. And then it hit him. The train was no longer the only thing moving in the desert. There was another train. A second train. It appeared out of the darkness like a phantom, materializing from the void. At first, Harrison thought it was a trick of the light, the headlights from another locomotive reflecting off the dust. But no, this was real. This train was identical to his own, the Union Pacific 4872, but it was different. There were no lights on board, no crew, no passengers. It was an empty shell, hurtling toward him with terrifying speed. The headlights cut through the night like twin suns, blinding and cold, but there was no sound from the whistle. No sound of the engine. Just a deep, unnatural hum that vibrated in Harrison's chest. The train was getting closer. It was moving faster than Harrison's own, as if it was racing to meet him, to overtake him. But there was no one at the controls. No one in the cabin. And the most chilling thing of all? It was not slowing down. Harrison's mind raced as the reality of what he was seeing hit him. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This train, this ghost train, was coming for him. The wheels were turning, the steel tracks groaning under its weight, but there was no one to steer it. No one to stop it. The rumble of the ghost train grew louder, a low growl vibrating through the train's metal frame. Harrison's stomach churned. He had heard the stories of ghost trains, of the supernatural forces that haunted the desert, but he had always thought it was just folklore, just drunken tales told to scare the rookies. But now, he was living it. The second train was right on his tail, the eerie hum growing louder with each passing second. His heart hammered in his chest as he slammed his hand onto the throttle, trying to increase the speed, to escape the oncoming phantom, but it was useless. The ghost train was faster, more relentless. It didn't even need tracks to stay on course. Harrison could hear the sound of the tracks vibrating beneath him, the strange, unnatural hum growing louder and louder. The ghost train was getting closer. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was he hallucinating? No, he couldn't be. The train was right there, inches away from him. The horses, the voice, Miles, they were all part of something. And now, this ghost train was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the culmination of a curse that had been set in motion long before Harrison had even arrived. He glanced out the window again, his breath caught in his throat. The horses were still standing there, unmoving, their eyes locked onto him with a chilling, knowing stare. The leader, the stallion, remained in the front, watching as the ghost train bore down on him, as if it were part of the plan. It knew. The herd knew what was coming. They had been waiting for him, waiting for the ghost train to arrive. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again. Roy's voice, sharp and urgent, came through. "Harrison, get out of there. Don't look back. Just go." But it was too late. The ghost train was upon him now, its lights blinding, its hum vibrating through every fiber of his being. Harrison's hands gripped the controls, but there was no escaping it now. The desert had claimed him. The ghost train was a force beyond understanding, beyond control. And as the two trains neared each other, Harrison realized something that made his blood run cold. The ghost train wasn't just chasing him. It was taking him. The eerie hum of the ghost train was deafening now. Harrison could feel its presence closing in on him, the pressure mounting, the weight of the moment too much to bear. The blinding lights from the approaching train lit up the dark desert like twin suns, but they didn't bring comfort. They brought dread. A sense that something was about to collapse, to break open, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. His hands were shaking on the throttle. Sweat beaded on his brow as he stared out the window at the ghost train, which was now right beside him, its lights casting an otherworldly glow over the desert landscape. And yet, it wasn't just the ghost train that caught his attention. It was the tracks. He had been so focused on the surreal events unfolding around him, on the ghost train, on the herd of horses, that he had failed to notice something that should have been impossible. The tracks ahead of him were gone. Where once there had been the sturdy, reliable steel rails that had guided the train for decades, there was now nothing. Just empty space. A black, inky void stretched out before him, swallowing up the path, as though the very earth had disappeared beneath him. The desert had become a vast chasm, an abyss. The tracks he had relied on for so long, the very foundation of his world, had vanished. Harrison's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the controls, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The train wasn't moving forward anymore. The momentum that had once powered it now felt useless. There was no track to guide him, no destination to reach. His heart hammered in his chest as panic set in. There was nowhere to go. The train had come to a screeching halt, but not by his own doing. It wasn't just the brakes or the hand on the throttle that had stopped it. No, something bigger was at work here, something that had pulled the rails from beneath him and left him stranded in the void. It was as if the very laws of nature had been upended. What the hell? Harrison muttered, his voice shaking as he stared at the empty, dark abyss where the tracks should have been. The cabin was eerily silent now, except for the distant, muffled sound of the ghost train, which had grown quieter, but was still there, a constant presence in his mind. He reached for the radio, his fingers trembling as he grabbed the receiver, his heart pounding. Roy, do you copy? Static crackled through the radio, and for a moment, Harrison thought he was hearing things. But then Roy's voice came through, distorted and distant, as though coming from far beyond the radio's reach. Harrison, Roy said, his voice low and urgent, but with an undertone of something else. Fear. I warned you. I told you not to stop. But you didn't listen. Now you've crossed over into something you can't escape. Harrison's breath hitched in his chest. Roy, what are you talking about? There's no track. It's gone. The train is stuck. I know, Roy said, his tone tinged with a resignation that sent a chill down Harrison's spine. I know what's happening. It's the curse, Harrison. You're on the other side of it now. The tracks, they've disappeared because the desert has taken them. You've entered the space where the living can't reach. And the ghost train, it's part of that, part of the pull of the past, part of what happened to Miles. Harrison felt his heart drop into his stomach. Miles. He had been wondering how the disappearance of his friend fit into all of this. He thought he had left those ghosts behind long ago. He had tried to forget the tragedy that had happened 20 years ago. But now, those ghosts had come back, and they were dragging him down with them. Miles? Harrison choked out. His voice was barely a whisper. Miles is part of this? Yes, Roy's voice came through, thick with regret. You didn't stop for him that night, Harrison. You kept going, thinking everything would be fine, thinking you were just doing your job. But you weren't. You were running away from something. From the very thing that took Miles. And now it's your turn. Harrison could feel the weight of Roy's words pressing down on him like an iron vice. The truth was crashing down on him with brutal force. The events of that night, the things he had chosen not to think about, were coming back to haunt him, to drag him into the void where there was no escape. The air in the cabin felt thicker now, as though it were closing in around him. Harrison's thoughts spun out of control. He could hear the ghost train still humming in the distance, and the horses, the damn horses, were still there, their eyes glowing, watching. Waiting. And then, suddenly, he heard it. A voice. A voice he knew all too well. Harrison. Harrison's heart stopped. He turned sharply toward the sound of the voice, his mind racing to process what was happening. The voice came again, clear as day, though it sounded distant, far away, yet right in front of him. Miles? Harrison whispered, his throat dry. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. But there it was, Miles' voice. You shouldn't have left me, the voice echoed, softer this time, but still unmistakable. You could have stopped. You could have helped me, but you didn't. Harrison's blood ran cold. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't a hallucination. This was Miles, speaking from the void, speaking from a place beyond the living. He had been trapped, his soul caught in this cycle, and Harrison was the reason why. The reason why Miles had never been able to move on. Harrison shook his head, a wave of guilt and regret crashing over him. Miles, I didn't know. I didn't know what was happening. You knew, Harrison, Miles' voice replied, his tone calm but filled with a sadness that cut to the core. You felt it. You knew something was wrong, but you kept running. You didn't stop. And now you're part of it. You've crossed the line, just like I did. The reality hit Harrison like a freight train, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The weight of it all, the guilt, the loss, the curse that had followed them both, had become too much to bear. He had failed Miles that night. And now, he was paying the price. No, Miles, The voice cut through him, sharp and final. It's too late, Harrison. You have to face what you've done. The desert, it claims everyone. And now, it's claiming you. The radio crackled again, the static growing louder as Harrison's mind spun. Roy, do you hear me? He shouted, his voice frantic now. But the radio didn't answer. The line went silent, and all Harrison could hear was the hum of the ghost train, the soft rustling of the horses, and Miles' voice still lingering in the air. With a final, resigned breath, Harrison turned to the controls. He realized, then, that there was no going back. The tracks had disappeared. The ghost train was closing in. And Miles was lost. Harrison felt something shift inside him, a sense of acceptance mingling with his fear. He couldn't change the past, but he could face what was coming. It was time to make a choice. And that choice, he knew, would define everything. The train was no longer his to command. The world around him was changing, warping, breaking down. And as the horses continued to stare into his soul, as the ghost train loomed ever closer, Harrison understood he had crossed the threshold. The desert had claimed him, and now he had to decide whether to face the consequences of his choices or run from them forever. But running, as he had learned, was no longer an option. Harrison sat in the cabin, his hands cold and stiff on the controls, his heart pounding in his chest like the rhythmic churning of the train's wheels. The desert outside was eerily still, like the calm before a storm. The horses, still standing motionless, formed an impenetrable wall before him, their dark eyes glowing like the embers of a dying fire. The ghost train loomed behind him, its presence undeniable and suffocating. He could feel it, the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. The mistakes he had made, the times he had ignored the signs, the times he had chosen to keep going when he should have stopped. And now, here he was, on the edge of something beyond his understanding, something beyond his control. The voice of Miles lingered in his ears, like a ghost that refused to let go. The words "you didn't stop" echoed through his mind. And now, as the train sat motionless, surrounded by the unyielding presence of the herd and the ghost train, Harrison finally understood. He had been running all his life. Running from his responsibilities, running from the pain, from the truth. Running from the one thing he should have faced head-on when he had the chance. But no more. As the ghost train drew closer, its lights shining brighter, he knew there was no escaping. The desert, the horses, the specter of Miles, they were all part of something he couldn't outrun anymore. The past had caught up to him. And now, he had to face it. The weight of his guilt hit him like a freight train itself. He thought back to that night, 20 years ago. The night when Miles had disappeared. He had been there, had seen his friend stranded on the tracks, but he had driven on. He had kept going, believing that his job was more important, that he couldn't afford to stop. He had thought he could outrun the consequences of his actions. But he was wrong. The consequences had caught up to him in the most terrifying way possible, and now there was no way to undo the past. The desert had claimed them all, Miles, himself, the ghost train, and everyone else who had crossed these cursed tracks. Harrison could feel the air thickening, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The trains, both the real one and the ghostly one, were getting closer. The horses, unmoving, were like sentinels, blocking his path to escape. But there was nowhere to run. No more tracks to follow. The train's whistle sounded one final time, a low, mournful blast that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the earth. And then, it happened. The ghost train collided with his own, the two trains merging in a blur of light, sound, and metal. Time itself seemed to slow as the final moment came. The train, Harrison's train, began to shudder, its wheels grinding against the empty space where the tracks had once been. The crash was deafening, but there was no destruction. No explosion. Just a final, inevitable merging of the two trains, and then, all was still. The horses, the ghost train, the desert, they all faded away into the darkness. Harrison found himself standing alone. The train was gone. The tracks were gone. And for the first time, the silence wasn't oppressive. It wasn't the eerie silence of death or doom. It was the silence of acceptance. And in that silence, he understood. He understood that it wasn't just about the train or the tracks. It wasn't even about Miles, or the horses, or the ghost train. It was about choices. It was about the choices we make when we're confronted with the truth. The choices we make when faced with the past. And the consequences that come when we fail to stop, to listen, to acknowledge what's been left behind. The past doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade away with time. It doesn't get buried under the weight of the present. It sits with us. It waits for us to face it. And when we don't, when we keep running, it comes back, in ways we can't predict, in ways that will always find us. And the price for running from the truth is steep. It is a price we can never escape. Harrison paid that price. He paid it in full. The desert had claimed him, just as it had claimed Miles. But in the end, it didn't take everything. He was left with the truth. The only thing left to him was the truth of what he had done, and the knowledge that it was time to stop running. To stop avoiding the past. It was time to face it. And in the end, maybe that was the only real victory he could ever claim. The story of Harrison Blake is a reminder that we cannot escape the consequences of our past decisions. The more we run from the truth, the more it catches up with us in ways we cannot predict. Whether it is the guilt of an unheeded warning, the consequences of a decision left unmade, or the price we pay for not confronting the past, the truth will always find its way back. And when it does, the only thing left to do is face it. The story shows us that no matter how far we run, no matter how deep we bury our mistakes, they will always surface. The cost of not stopping, of not facing what is true, is far greater than any price we could imagine. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply to stop and acknowledge the past, no matter how painful it may be. We must all face the tracks we've crossed. And when we do, we will finally find peace. Not by running, but by standing still. For only in facing our truth can we ever hope to move forward.